They had the gallows half built before the trial even started, which tells you everything about how much justice the mail-order bride was going to get in the town of Graydon, Montana, in the autumn of 1876. She sat in the crowded log courtroom in a torn dress with a bruise still yellow-green along her jaw, accused of murdering the man who had sent for her, and the whole territory had already made up its mind that she'd hang for it. Vernon Rourke had been a respected man in Graydon, a prosperous rancher with a smooth manner and a lot of friends, and the woman in the dock was a penniless stranger who'd been in the county 3 weeks, and everyone knew how that arithmetic came out. The rope, folks said, was a formality. Her name was Rachel Ames, and she was 26, and she had come west to marry Vernon Rourke, believing the kind, gentle letters he'd sent, and she had learned within a day of arriving exactly what those letters had been worth. Now Rourke was dead, killed in his own barn, and Rachel had been found nearby with his blood on her hands, and no story anyone would believe, and the prosecutor was painting her as a scheming murderess who'd killed a good man for his money. She had no lawyer worth the name, no friends, no money, and no way to make a hostile town believe that the respected Vernon Rourke had been, behind his smooth manner, a monster, and that she had done what she'd done to keep from becoming his next victim. She sat in the dock and looked at the half-built gallows through the window and understood that she was going to die for the crime of surviving. There was one man in that courtroom who knew the truth, and he sat in the back, quiet, with a leather satchel on his knees, and his name was Corwin Blake. He was a lean grave rancher from the far end of the valley, a man who mostly kept to himself, and for 2 years he had been quietly gathering a truth about Vernon Rourke that no one in Graydon suspected, a truth so dark that even now, watching an innocent woman being marched toward the rope, he had to steel himself to stand up and speak it, because the hidden truth Corwin Blake carried in that satchel was not only going to save Rachel Ames's life, it was going to tear the respectable face right off the dead man the whole town was mourning, and it was going to break Corwin's own heart open in front of everyone, and he had been dreading this day for 2 long years. To understand what Corwin Blake stood up and said in that courtroom, and why it silenced a town that had come to see a hanging, you have to go back to the letters and the barn, and a truth that had been buried under Graydon's respect for far too long. Rachel Ames had been an orphan and a hired seamstress in Minnesota, alone in the world and tired of it, when Vernon Rourke's advertisement found her, and his letters had seemed like the answer to a lonely woman's prayers. He wrote beautifully, Rourke did, all warmth and gentleness and promises of a good life on a fine Montana ranch, and Rachel, who had no one and nothing, let herself believe every word and fall a little in love with the man on the page. She spent her small savings on the passage and came west with a hopeful heart, and Vernon Rourke met her at the Graydon station with a smile and a bunch of wildflowers, and for exactly 1 day he was the man from the letters. The change came the first night at his ranch, and it came all at once, the way it does with men who wear a mask in public. The smooth, charming Vernon Rourke of the station and the letters simply vanished, and in his place was a cold, cruel man who informed Rachel that she now belonged to him, that the letters had been a means to an end, and that she would learn quickly to do as she was told, or wish she had. When she protested, he struck her, calm and unhurried, the way a man does a thing he has done many times before. Rachel Ames understood, that first terrible night, that she had crossed a continent into a trap, that she was married in the eyes of the county to a monster wearing a respected man's face, and that no one in Graydon would ever believe the smiling Vernon Rourke was anything but the fine fellow they knew. She endured 3 weeks of it, 3 weeks of a fear she had no words for, and she learned things about her husband in those weeks that turned her fear into terror. She found, hidden in his things, letters and small keepsakes from other women, several of them, women whose names she did not know, and when she'd asked Rourke about a locket that plainly belonged to some other bride, the look that came over his face had frozen the blood in her veins. He'd told her, soft and smiling, that she asked too many questions, and that the other women who'd asked too many questions were not around anymore to ask any, and he'd left her to think about that. Rachel had begun, from that night, to plan her escape, because she'd understood that she was not the first woman Vernon Rourke had sent for, and that the others were dead, and that she was meant to join them. What Rachel Ames did not know, what nobody in Graydon knew, was that another person had spent 2 years reaching the same terrible conclusion about Vernon Rourke, and that person was Corwin Blake. 2 years before Rachel ever arrived, Corwin's younger sister Lucy had come west as Vernon Rourke's mail-order bride, a bright laughing girl of 20, and within a few months, the word had come to Corwin that Lucy had died of a sudden fever and been buried before he could even travel to her. Corwin had come anyway, grief-struck, and he had stood at his sister's grave and listened to Vernon Rourke's smooth, sorrowful account of her passing, and something in it had not sat right, some false note under the grief that Corwin, who had known his sister's whole life, could not stop hearing. So Corwin Blake had done a quiet, patient, obsessive thing. He had bought a small ranch at the far end of the valley and settled in, and for 2 years he had watched Vernon Rourke and dug into his past, telling no one, gathering every scrap he could find, because he could not shake the certainty that his laughing sister had not died of any fever. And slowly, over those 2 years, the terrible pattern had emerged from Corwin's patient digging. Vernon Rourke had sent for brides before, more than once, from towns far apart where the news would not travel, and each of those women had come west full of hope and then, within a season, quietly died or simply vanished. And each time Rourke had spun a sorrowful, believable tale and moved on. Corwin had gathered the proof of it, letter by letter, record by record, a lawman's dodger from another territory, a locket, the sworn word of a woman in Denver whose sister had been one of Rourke's vanished brides. He had almost enough. That was the agony of it that Corwin carried. He had spent 2 years building a case against a careful murderer, and he had been close, so close, to having enough hard proof to bring Vernon Rourke to a rope for what he'd done to Lucy and the others. And then Rachel Ames had arrived, and Corwin, watching from the far end of the valley, had seen a new bride come, and had known, with a sick certainty, exactly what she was walking into, and he had been racing to gather the last of his proof before Rourke could do to this new woman what he'd done to Corwin's sister. He had not been fast enough to spare her the 3 weeks of terror, but he had, as it turned out, been just fast enough to matter. The night Vernon Rourke died, Rachel Ames had finally run. She had gathered the little she could carry and slipped out in the dark to make for the stage road, and Rourke had caught her at the barn. And what happened there was the thing the prosecutor called murder, and Rachel called the worst and most necessary moment of her life. Rourke had come at her in the lantern-lit barn, and this time there had been something final in it, the smiling gone entirely, and Rachel had understood that he did not mean to punish her escape, but to end it, permanently, the way he'd ended the others. In the struggle for her life, fighting a stronger man who meant to kill her, Rachel had gotten hold of a hay knife, and she had used it, and Vernon Rourke had died on the barn floor. She had knelt there afterward, shaking, covered in his blood, and she had not run, because there was nowhere to run, and no one who would believe her, and that was how the ranch hands found her at dawn, over the body, knife nearby, and that was the whole of the case against her. To Graydon it was plain as day. The scheming stranger bride had murdered her respected husband, likely for his money, and been caught red-handed, and the only thing left was the trial and the rope, and the town built the gallows while the trial was still being arranged. So sure were they of how it would end. Nobody asked why a woman would murder a man 3 weeks after crossing a continent to marry him. Nobody looked at the yellow-green bruise on her jaw and wondered. The respected Vernon Rourke was dead, and someone had to hang for it, and the friendless stranger was right there. But Corwin Blake had heard the news of Rourke's death and Rachel's arrest, and he had sat in his small ranch house at the end of the valley, with 2 years of gathered proof spread on the table in front of him. And he had understood 2 things at once. The first was that Rachel Ames had almost certainly done exactly what Lucy might have done if she'd had the chance, killed a monster in self-defense of her own life. The second was that Corwin now held the power to save an innocent woman and finally expose his sister's murderer, but only if he was willing to stand up in front of the whole town and lay bare everything, The 2 years of secret digging, the truth about the man they respected, the grief he'd carried alone. He had 2 days to decide, and he did not sleep either of them. The trial, such as it was, went exactly as Graydon expected, right up until it didn't. The prosecutor laid out his simple, ugly story, the scheming bride and the murdered husband and the bloody knife, and he called Rourke's ranch hands who told of finding her over the body, and he painted Rachel Ames as a cold murderess in tones that had the packed courtroom murmuring for the rope. Rachel's court-appointed lawyer, a timid young man who plainly believed his client guilty, put up almost no defense at all. And Rachel herself, when they let her speak, told the truth, the whole terrible truth about Rourke, and the letters, and the other women's keepsakes, and the barn, and she watched it land on the hostile faces and changed nothing, because the truth from a friendless stranger's mouth was just a murderess's desperate lie to the people of Graydon. She had finished, and the judge was preparing to send it to the jury that everyone knew would convict, when a lean, grave man stood up in the back of the courtroom with a leather satchel in his hand and asked, in a quiet voice that somehow carried over the whole room, to be heard. The judge, a fair enough man named Doone who had been uneasy about the whole rushed business, allowed it, and Corwin Blake walked to the front of that courtroom carrying 2 years of grief and proof, and he was sworn, and he began to speak, and within 5 minutes you could have heard a pin drop in a room that had come to see a hanging. He told them who he was. He told them about his sister Lucy, who had come to Graydon 2 years before as Vernon Rourke's bride, laughing and bright, and had died of a sudden fever and been buried before her own brother could reach her. He told them how the false note in Rourke's grief had haunted him, and how he had spent 2 years quietly digging, and then, one piece at a time, he laid the contents of his satchel on the table before the stunned court. The letters, the records from 3 far-apart territories, the lawman's dodger, the sworn statement from the woman in Denver, the keepsakes of vanished women. Piece by piece, Corwin Blake built in that courtroom the thing he had spent 2 years building in secret, the proof that the respected Vernon Rourke had sent for bride after bride across the years, and that each of them had died or vanished, and that the man Graydon was mourning had been, behind his smooth, respected face, a patient and practiced murderer of the very women who trusted him. There is a line from Francis Bacon that Corwin Blake proved true that day in the Graydon courtroom. "Truth is the daughter of time," Bacon wrote, "not of authority." For 2 years, the authority of Graydon's respect had buried the truth about Vernon Rourke, and it had taken time, and one patient grieving man's refusal to let his sister's death go unquestioned, to bring that truth up into the light where it could not be denied. And once it stood in the light, laid out piece by damning piece on the table of that log courtroom, the whole town's certainty came apart in front of everyone's eyes. The prosecutor tried to fight it, blustering that this was all a stranger's fabrication, but the proof was too solid and too documented for bluster, and the courtroom could feel the truth of it settling over them like a cold wind. Men who had called Vernon Rourke friend sat with gray faces, remembering things now, the brides who'd come and gone, the stories that had seemed sad at the time and sinister now. And Rachel Ames sat in the dock and listened to a stranger she had never met stand up and prove, with 2 years of patient work, the very thing she had been unable to make anyone believe, that Vernon Rourke was a monster and that she had killed him to keep from being the next name on his terrible list. She began, silently, to weep, not from fear now, but from the first mercy anyone in Montana had shown her. Corwin Blake turned then, and for the first time he looked directly at Rachel Ames across that courtroom, and he spoke to the jury, but he was speaking to her too. He said that whatever had happened in that barn had happened between a defenseless woman and a man who had already murdered a string of women exactly like her, that she had done in that barn only what his own sister Lucy would have given anything to have had the chance to do, and that if there was any justice at all in the territory of Montana, they would not hang a woman for surviving a monster, but would thank God she had lived to help bring his evil into the light. Then Corwin Blake sat down, spent and shaking, having laid his 2-year burden and his private grief bare in front of the whole town, and the courtroom erupted. Judge Doone did not even send it to the jury. He did not have to. He looked at the proof spread across the table, and at the weeping woman in the dock, and at the town's collapse certainty, and he dismissed the charge against Rachel Ames then and there, ruling that no jury in the land could call it murder for a woman to kill a proven serial murderer who was in the act of killing her. He ordered the half-built gallows torn down, and he said, from the bench, in a voice heavy with the shame of a town that had nearly hanged an innocent woman, that Graydon owed Rachel Ames and Corwin Blake both a debt it could not easily pay, the one for surviving a horror the town had been too blind to see, and the other for the 2 lonely years of work that had finally dragged the truth into the light. Rachel walked out of that courtroom, a free woman, into a Graydon that could not meet her eyes, a town wrestling with the terrible knowledge that it had respected a murderer and nearly hanged his victim. She was free, but she was also alone again, penniless and friendless in a strange territory, a widow of a man everyone now knew to have been a monster, with nowhere in the world to go. She stood on the courthouse steps in the autumn cold, blinking in the light of a life she had not expected to keep, and she did not know what to do with it or where to take it. It was Corwin Blake who came and stood beside her on those steps, awkward and quiet, still hollowed out from the day. He did not make any grand offer, because that was not his way, and because they were both far too raw for it. He simply told her that he had a small ranch at the end of the valley, and a spare room that had been his sister's, and that she was welcome to it for as long as she needed, while she found her feet. No strings and no expectations, only one survivor of Vernon Rourke, offering shelter to another. Rachel looked at the grave, gentle man who had saved her life with 2 years of patient grief, and she saw in his tired eyes the same haunted thing she carried in her own, and she accepted, because she had nowhere else, and because, of all the people in Montana, this was the one who understood. They were careful with each other, at first, the way 2 badly wounded people are, and the healing came slow, over that long Montana winter, in a house at the end of the valley, where 2 survivors of the same monster slowly learned that they were safe. Rachel took the room that had been Lucy's, and she found, going through the small things Corwin had kept of his sister, that she came to know and love the laughing girl she'd never met, the girl whose fate Rachel had so nearly shared. And Corwin, who had lived 2 years alone with nothing but his grief and his grim purpose, found that having Rachel in the house, hearing another voice, sharing the silence, began to thaw something in him that had been frozen since the day he'd stood at Lucy's grave. They did not speak of love that winter because it would have been too soon and too much, but the thing grew anyway, quiet and deep, in the small daily kindnesses of 2 people healing side by side. Rachel learned that the grave, silent Corwin had a dry, gentle humor buried under the grief, and that he was patient and steady and safe in a way she had stopped believing a man could be. Corwin learned that Rachel, for all she had suffered, had a warmth and a resilience that had survived even Vernon Rourke, that she could laugh again, that she made his lonely house feel like a home for the first time since Lucy died. Each of them had thought the capacity for happiness had been beaten or grieved out of them for good, and each of them was discovering, to their quiet astonishment, that it had only been waiting for safety to come back. By the time the spring came and thawed the valley, the thing between them had grown into something that neither could any longer pretend was only shelter and shared grief. It was Rachel who finally named it. One evening on the porch as the snow went off the high pasture, because she had learned the hard way not to leave true things unsaid. She told Corwin that he had saved her life in that courtroom, and then saved it again all through the winter in a quieter way, and that somewhere in the saving she had fallen in love with the gravest, gentlest, bravest man she had ever known, and that if he did not feel the same, she would understand, but she would not be able to forgive herself for not having said it. Corwin Blake looked at the woman on his porch, the woman he had pulled back from the gallows, the woman who had spent a winter bringing his sister's room and his frozen heart back to life, and everything he had held in for 2 hard years came loose at once. He told her that he had loved her a little from the moment he'd stood up in that courtroom and finally looked at her across the room, one survivor to another, and that he'd loved her more every day of the winter, and that he had not spoken because he'd feared she could never see him as anything but the reminder of the worst day of her life. He told her that having her in the house had done what 2 years of grim purpose never could, which was to make his sister's death mean something other than a hole in the world, because saving Rachel had turned all that grief into the thing that spared another woman Lucy's fate. "I spent 2 years living for nothing but proving what happened to Lucy," Corwin said, taking Rachel's hands in his grave face open at last. "I thought when it was done, I'd have nothing left, that the proving was the only thing keeping me alive. And then you walked out of that courtroom with nowhere to go, and I found I had something to live for after all, and it wasn't grief, it was you. I love you, Rachel, not in spite of everything we've both survived. Because of it, we are 2 people who came through the same fire, and I don't want to spend whatever life I've got left living at opposite ends of it. Marry me. Let's take the terrible thing that brought us together and build something good enough to answer it." Rachel Ames, who had crossed a continent for a monster and found, on the far side of the horror, the one truly good man in Montana, put her arms around Corwin Blake and held on, and told him yes, and told him that Vernon Rourke had meant to leave nothing behind him but dead women and grief, and that the finest revenge either of them could ever take was to be happy, to love each other openly and fully in the very valley where he'd tried to kill them both. They were married that spring, in the little church at Graydon, and the town that had nearly hanged Rachel came out in force, humbled and glad, to see the 2 survivors wed. It was, everyone agreed, a strange and moving wedding. 2 people who had been through hell, standing up in the light, and choosing, in front of everyone, joy. "I will tell you how it went, because you have come the whole way and earned it." Corwin and Rachel Blake lived out their lives in that valley at the end of Montana, and they built on the site of the worst thing that ever happened to either of them, a life of such quiet, steady happiness that the memory of Vernon Rourke shrank, over the years, into something small and far away, a defeated thing. They had children, and they named their first daughter Lucy, after the laughing girl whose death had, in the strange arithmetic of grief, led her brother to the woman he loved, and little Lucy grew up knowing she was named for an aunt who watched over them. Rachel became, in time, a fierce, quiet protector of other women, for she never forgot what it was to arrive somewhere hopeful and find a trap, and no mail-order bride ever came to Graydon again without Rachel Blake finding a way to make sure the woman was safe and had somewhere to turn if she wasn't. Between her watchfulness and the town's hard-earned shame, Graydon never again respected a smooth manner over a bruised jaw, never again took a respected man's word over a frightened stranger's, because the town had learned, the terrible way, exactly what such blindness could nearly cost. Corwin's 2 years of patient truth-seeking had not only saved Rachel, it had changed the whole valley's idea of what justice required. When Rachel Blake was an old woman, a young woman of the town, herself trapped in a bad marriage no one believed was bad, came to her in secret and asked how she had ever survived and how she had ever come to trust or love again after what she'd been through. Rachel took the frightened young woman's hands and told her the truth of her own life. "I married a monster who wore a respected man's face," she said, "and a whole town was ready to hang me rather than believe a stranger over a smile. And one patient, grieving man refused to let a buried truth stay buried, and he saved my life, and then he spent it loving me back to whole. The lesson, child, is that the truth is stronger than any respect that hides it, but only if somebody is brave enough to dig it up and stand up and say it out loud. Find the ones who dig for the truth. Those are the ones worth trusting. Those are the ones worth loving. And if you are the one in the trap, hold on, because somewhere there may be a Corwin Blake, patiently, quietly, coming for the truth of you." Here is what stays with me about Corwin Blake. A whole town had a smooth and respected story it wanted to believe, and it was ready to build a gallows and hang an innocent woman rather than question it, because the truth was uglier and harder than the comfortable lie. And it took one grieving man, with no power but patience and no weapon but the truth, 2 years of lonely digging, and 1 act of terrible public courage to bring the real story into the light and save a life the town was ready to throw away. We are all, more than we like to think, a town that prefers the comfortable story. Be the one who digs. Be the one who stands up in the back of the room with the hidden truth in your hands, even when your voice shakes, even when it breaks your own heart to say it. Truth is the daughter of time, and sometimes she needs a brave and patient midwife. Corwin Blake was one, and he saved a life and found a love in the doing, and I do not think a man can do much better than that. If this one moved you, stay a while by the fire. There are more of them coming, more people the world was ready to condemn on a smooth lie, and every last one is worth the time it takes to tell.